Good evening, everyone. I'm Dwayne Johnson Cochran, Chair of the Genre Committee. Thank you all for being online with us tonight. I welcome you all to this timely, topical, and very political panel discussion to explore the impact of film and television on politics and vice versa. But before our intros, I'd like to introduce Kelly Jo Brick, Vice Chair of the Genre Committee. Kelly Jo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I just want to do a few quick things before we get going. First of all, to Greg, our guild liaison, who does so much hard work behind the scenes to bring events like this together and to help all of us writers shine. We really appreciate his efforts. Many thanks to the panelists for joining us tonight and being so open and sharing their experiences with us. And also to the team that brought this event together, led by Lori. I just want to let you know about a couple things we have coming up. The Genre Committee is sponsoring this event. We celebrate all things genre, and we would love to have you come join us at our upcoming meeting. Our next meeting is the first Tuesday in December. We help plan events like this. We often have guests to talk about, the current state of the industry. Also, we have an event coming up on Thursday, October 24th. It's going to be in person, writing for the faith-based film industry. And Dwayne.
Thank you, Kelly Jo. My panel moderator tonight is Lori Gambino. She's a screenwriter and executive producer of the upcoming feature film Anniversary, a provocative, dramatic thriller about a close-knit family torn apart as a new political movement envelops the country. The movie stars Diane Lane, Phoebe Dynevor, Kyle Chandler, and McKenna Grace, and fifth season in Lionsgate will release the film in 2025. Lori is developing a slate of projects with her husband and producing partner David Gambino, and they recently sold a television series to SK Global. Any further ado, our panel tonight with Lori Gambino as our moderator. Thank you, everyone.
Welcome to A More Perfect Union, Politics in Film and Television. Well, it is 21 days from the most consequential election of our lifetimes. Democracy is on the ballot. Never before have we witnessed such an open attack on our institutions, from voter registrations to attempted theft of an election to plutocrats angling to manipulate opinion. Cut to Hollywood, where political storytelling is an endangered species. With Wall Street's influence on our business, controversy is out and risk aversion is in. But tonight, our panel continues to tackle hot button issues that challenge and provoke, and we want the scoop. So let me introduce them. Dustin Lance Black is a filmmaker, writer, and LGBTQ+ activist. He won the Academy Award and 2 Writers Guild Awards for his screenplay Milk. He's received WGAW West Valentine Davies Award for his humanitarian service. He's a founding member of the American Foundation of Equal Rights, which successfully led the federal cases for marriage equality, ending California's discriminatory Prop 8. Dustin created, executive produced, wrote, and directed Under the Banner of Heaven and the miniseries When We Rise. He also co-wrote the Academy Award-nominated film Rustin, as well as wrote the screenplays for J. Edgar and Pedro. Scott Z. Burns is an award-winning screenwriter, director, producer, and playwright. His writing and credits include The Bourne Ultimatum, The Informant, Contagion, Side Effects, The Laundromat. As a screenwriter, his credits include, screenwriter-director, his credits include PU 239, The Report. He produced the Academy Award-winning documentary An Inconvenient Truth, for which he received the Humanitas Prize, and is executive producer of An Inconvenient Sequel, which won the Sundance Award. In television, he's a writer, director, executive producer, and creator of the TV series Extrapolations, which won an Environmental Media Association Award. Debora Cahn is a creator and showrunner of Netflix critically acclaimed series The Diplomat, which was nominated for a Critics' Choice Award, Golden Globe, and Writers and Producers Guild Award for Best Drama. Her previous credits include writer and executive producer on the award-winning series Homeland, Fosse Verdon, Martin Scorsese's HBO series Vinyl, Grey's Anatomy, and is a co-writer of the HBO film Paterno. She began her career on The West Wing and is part of that staff that won the Emmy for Outstanding Drama. She won a Writers Guild Award for her episode and won a second WGA award for her work on Fosse Verdon. Rick Cleveland is a playwright and an Emmy-winning writer-producer whose television credits include The West Wing, 6 Feet Under, Mad Men, Nurse Jackie, House of Cards, Archer, Legit, and The Man in the High Castle. Rick is not only is the only writer not named Aaron Sorkin to win an Emmy Award for his writing on The West Wing. He also won the jury award at the HBO Comedy Arts Festival for his one-man show, My Buddy Bill, and performed the piece for a 1-hour Comedy Central special. Billy Ray wrote the Oscar-nominated screenplay Captain Phillips, for which he won the Writers Guild Award. Billy's films as writer, co-writer, or writer-director include The Hunger Games, Richard Jewell, Shattered Glass, and Showtime's The Comey Rule, which had the biggest debut of any limited series in the network's history. He's an activist in the Democratic Party and provides messaging to help 85 sitting members of the House and Senate. And we're definitely going to talk to him about that tonight. And many of you may recognize our special guest, Annette Insdorf. She's a professor of film at Columbia University's School of Arts and a moderator for the popular Real Pieces series at the 92nd Street Y, where she's interviewed over 300 celebrities. She is the author of a landmark study, Indelible Shadows, Film and the Holocaust, Double Lives, Second Chances, the Cinema of Krzysztof Kozlowski, Francis Truffaut, a study in the French director's work, Philip Kaufman, and Intimation, the Cinema of Wojciech Haas. Her current book, Cinematic Overtures, How to Read Opening Scenes, is currently in its 4th printing. So we're going to start tonight with Professor Insdorf. Take it away.
Thank you for the invitation to provide background and context for this panel. As a film historian, I see the relationship between American politics and film or television as a dynamic and intersecting one. Ever since the invention of motion pictures, movies have reflected and conditioned how we see ourselves individually as well as collectively. If we recall what is considered the peak of Hollywood years, 1939, films were the prime source of communal vision, ideology, and aspiration. 439 American films were released in 1939, including Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Young Mr. Lincoln, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, Ninotchka. And 1 year earlier, Preston Sturges wrote and directed The Great McGinty, about a bum who's manipulated into the governor's chair by a crooked political machine. But I think that political films aren't necessarily about elections or governance. The word politics derives from the Greek poly, P-O-L-Y, the many, and the word polis, P-O-L-I-S, city. In 2024, it seems that cultural politics have supplanted the literally political films that were more visible, especially in the 1970s. Films about politics are perhaps less necessary given this 24-hour news cycle that emerged since then. Whether you watch TV or television, TV or TikTok, a viewer receives daily sensorial overloads of reality. And this is especially true for Gen Z, which makes up 27% of the global audience for TV and movies, more than any other generational group. I'm currently teaching a course on cinema history from 1960 to 90, and my Columbia students are grasping how the 1970s forged a socially engaged cinema. Yesterday, we watched a clip from Nashville, for example. But 50 years later, can we perceive the same widespread engagement of films with policy, elections, or even values? I think today Hollywood studios don't see red or blue states, they see green. Profit is the bottom line, and a partisan political film could lose half the country's ticket buyers. Hollywood films often follow the money and deal with hot button issues only by looking in the rearview mirror. Films were not being made about the Vietnam War while it was happening. Apocalypse Now and Platoon were made after the Vietnam War. We are far from the 1970s when movies like All the President's Men dramatized the Watergate scandal and Nixon's resignation. It was directed by Alan Pakula, who also made the overtly political Parallax View in 1974. Think back to The Candidate from 1972, directed by Michael Ritchie from a screenplay by Jeremy Larner. It was political, but not partisan. Going further back, The Best Man from 1964, script by Gore Vidal, was very political, but never identifies if the convention is the Republican or Democratic Party. 1964 was also the year of a movie called Kisses for My President, a comedy about the first female president, starring Polly Bergen and Fred McMurray. She resigns when she becomes pregnant. On the other hand, look at recent films like Killers of the Flower Moon or Rustin. Though set in the past, they are certainly about American government. This year's Dune 2, while obviously less explicitly political, offers Timothée Chalamet's Paul assuming the full responsibility of his legacy, leading the indigenous freemen people to victory over the exploiters, the Harkonnen. Superhero films are not simply high-tech hijinks. I recall The Avengers from 2012 had a pretty good message to boot. Even a superhero has to join with others for the team to work. And a tyrant who believes people don't really want freedom will not triumph. How perfect that Loki chooses Germany as the locus for his display of power. He makes a well-heeled crowd kneel to him, reenacting delusions of Übermensch glory. Fortunately, there's an older man in the crowd who refuses, knowing this was the site of such self-abnegation before. A few contemporary filmmakers have been more blunt in their socially aware scenarios. I look, for example, to the work of writer-director Adam McKay, whose Don't Look Up offered a bracing vision in 2021. His film Vice from 2018 traces the rise of Dick Cheney from a boozing young loser in 1963 Wyoming to arguably the most powerful man in the world during the early 2000s. The scariest part of that film, and it's especially relevant now, is Cheney's development, together with a young Antonin Scalia, of the unitary executive theory. It gives the president absolute authority, and in his interpretation, the vice president as well. I could imagine one of the current candidates for the presidency watching this film and liking the theory for himself. McKay also wrote and directed The Big Short in 2015, a smart, zippy black comedy about the 2008 financial crash. And let me call attention to the brilliant collaborations of the writer Danny Strong and director Jay Roach, namely Recount in 2008 and Game Change in 2012, both made for HBO. My husband, Mark Ethan Toporek, who's primarily an actor, included both films when he created a series about the interactions of film and politics. His course title was Reading Between the Lies. TV has been the vibrant focus of political exploration in the 1990s into 2000s. The West Wing, The Newsroom, Veep. They were addressing actual policy issues in idealistic as well as sardonic ways. I always thank Aaron Sorkin and Armando Iannucci, among others. And moreover, TV movies preceded Hollywood in docudramas with political content. Some of the American political films made for the big screen have been excellent, but not necessarily commercial. I couldn't resist the satire Irresistible in 2020, written and directed by Jon Stewart. This comedy is set in 2016 after the presidential election. It skewers a campaign system that depends on strategists, big bucks, and media manipulation. Ides of March in 2011 was directed by George Clooney, from Beau Willimon's play Farragut North. It begins and ends with the smart Democratic strategist played by Ryan Gosling, who turns out to be as flawed as the presidential candidate, George Clooney, for whom we root. We can recall Swing Vote from 2008, starring Kevin Costner. Much like Frank Capra's films, it makes a case for the ultimate decency of the American everyman, who often needs the push of a good woman or even a little girl to do the right thing. None were box office successes, a fact also true of The Frontrunner in 2018, the remake of All the King's Men in 2006, The Contender in 2007, and Lions for Lambs in 2007, addressing the ongoing Iraq war during the Bush administration, in spite of stars like Redford, Meryl Streep, Tom Cruise. One could invoke Samuel Goldwyn's line, "If you have a message, call Western Union." On the other hand, Wag the Dog, 97, was a successful satire about politics, not partisan. In contemporary films, the politics or culture of identity, that's far more prevalent. One focuses race. For example, Fruitvale Station in 2013, even before the Black Lives Matter movement, it led to more films about shootings by police. Last year, Ada DuVernay's Origin was an ambitious and engrossing drama inspired by Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. Origin isn't about the political system, but the social hierarchies that inform politics. DuVernay also directed in 2019 When They See Us, a superb series for Netflix. In this context, last month, the New York Film Festival opened with Nickel Boys. It's adapted from Colson Whitehead's novel and directed by Ramel Ross, offering cinematic poetry woven around the theme of racial reckoning. For a more direct interlacing of film and politics, we often look to foreign cinema, and exemplars that I keep teaching include the Battle of Algiers and Z in the late 60s, or The Official Story from Argentina, 1985, or the movies directed by Ken Loach and scripted by Paul Laverty. International cinema continues to offer stirring and provocative investigations. This year, 2 of the entries for the Best Foreign Language Film Oscar are powerful dramas that use the microcosm of a family to reveal the tyranny of a government. The Seed of the Sacred Fig, Mohamed Rasulov's Iranian drama representing Germany, and from Brazil, I'm Still Here. I hope that this has been a useful introduction, and I can't wait to hear what the gifted writers on this panel have to offer. Thanks.
Thank you, Annette, so much. Is it too late for me to enroll in your class?
No, I let auditors in all the time.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That was so insightful and much appreciated. We're going to move to the Q&A portion of the evening, and then we're going to later take audience questions. So please feel free to send them in. We're going to begin with Lance. Your film, Rustin, is about the March on Washington, with Bayard Rustin writing the blueprint for Black liberation in this country. It's produced by Michelle and Barack Obama. As an activist yourself, what was your personal connection to the story? And might we ask, what's it like getting notes from former president and the First Lady?
I mean, first of all, Annette, that was spectacular.
Isn't that great?
Thank you. I'm sort of like, it's going to take me a minute, sort of like getting out of a warm, beautiful bath. That landscape you just painted of where we've been, and it actually left me a little hopeful that we could see those days of the 70s again. Thank you. Rustin was a film I wanted to make, and I've not really spoken about this ever, but it was a film that I wanted to make before I even made Milk. He was a very inspirational figure to me, partly because he was queer, but that wasn't his sole focus. In fact, it wasn't his primary focus. And that I loved the way he embraced his otherness and found ways to get other people to do that and inside of the political machine. And the fact that he did it with such success, that as I started to do the research around Bayard, I found, and I bet there's a lot of people on this panel who know this, as you get close to some of the political figures who you might think are your heroes or are inspiring, it can often be incredibly disappointing. And though I never got to meet Bayard personally, I met his partner and all of the folks that he worked with, and he worked with people, the same people throughout much of his life. And I grew to care for him more and understand what his strategy was for success. The reason I make these movies and television shows is to move the needle. It's not nostalgia. It's to figure out how, the old saying, the past is prologue, how that can hold true, and can I make that true? Are there lessons from the past that can address the present and the future? And so, as someone who's interested in the equal treatment of people of difference, Bayard was a beautiful example, similar to Harvey Milk, of how you can communicate that effectively and actually move the needle politically. What kind of theater you need to put on to be able to communicate those ideas politically. And so, I'm not shy. I have a message and I use film and TV as best I can. I don't use Western Union. And I think it's incredibly difficult. Everyone on here will agree it can be incredibly difficult. But when you do succeed, and it can be rare, although there's a few of you I'm very, fond of on this panel who have tremendous track records. It's incredibly difficult. It's rare for it to hit. As Annette was saying, a lot of these wonderful projects with great messages that could be incredibly useful tools for today are never seen. But when it does break through and you do see the change that cinema can create, you can't turn away from that power. And I thought Bayard was someone who had been lost in history, whose example was a lesson for how we move forward now. I can see already certain politicians who have borrowed from him. And I don't think that's a pejorative. I think that's good, including Barack Obama. And I'll say, in terms of notes, I didn't get a whole lot of those. What we did and what they did for the film was in the same way that, when we have these impossible to make passion projects that the studios and networks don't see the green, you can attach folks and bring it to folks who make it look greener. And that can be producers like Barack and Michelle Obama, who I'm eternally grateful for and are wonderful. Or it can be the actors and the cast. And slowly you can turn this thing that looks like it is potentially a loss financially into something that's green enough to get made.
Thank you. Scott, the report deals with the investigation into the CIA's use of torture after September 11th. Your script is clearly heavily researched. Talk about the challenges of sort of culling a captivating story, but from what was essentially a hyper detailed 6,000 page document, right?
Well, that was really, really challenging. I think for me, I don't know that I actually consciously pick any project. I feel like they sort of choose me, and then I can't let go of them. And in the case of the report, I think there was a very personal part of it, which was there were two psychologists who had persuaded the CIA that torturing people was an effective way of getting information out of them. And my parents were both psychologists. So I found it, sort of fascinating that I had grown up with people who would never have believed that or tried to sell the government that bill of goods. And I was able to connect with Daniel Jones, who wrote the report. And I sort of wanted to do it as a dark comedy. much in the way that I tried to do The Informant. And that really bothered Daniel. And he couldn't tell me the full extent of what was really redacted. And I've always admired the fact that he's never told me. I mean, there are even things that have since come forward that were unredacted, or that other people who had, filed FOIA kind of briefs have been able to discover. Daniel still won't really speak about those things openly. And I became so taken with him as a messenger and him as a public servant, and as someone who believed if they did the right thing, that the system would work. And so that became the story I really wanted to tell, especially at a time where I felt in American politics like that was no longer happening. I mean, for someone like Daniel Jones, who worked in a basement with probably the most complete and gruesome set of facts that anyone in America, well, there's a lot of gruesome facts in American politics, but these are among the worst. It's stunning and it's devastating, and it's inspiring to see someone continue to do that. I had a lot of people, when we took the movie around, tell me that they really wanted to believe that torture worked. And turns out it just doesn't. Even actually the Nazis knew that torture didn't work. We hired one of their chief interrogators after the war to train our chief interrogators. And he even said, torturing people is ineffective. It's very hard to check their stories. It's very easy to fool the interrogator. There's a host of reasons, but the most compelling one, which, and this was a moment, and I'm sure Billy will appreciate this, Alberto Gonzalez, who was from the other side, and I, had an opportunity to meet, and, he was aghast at what had been done in the name of this country. And that to me, really was profoundly moving. At the time when we sold that movie to Amazon, it was the biggest sale ever at Sundance, for I think 2 nights, until someone else sold something to Amazon. It was sort of the beginning of the streamers showing up at festivals and buying films. But it is really frightening and devastating to now go out into the world and, have to deal with the fact that, you can't just tell the story you're passionate about. You can't just tell a story because it's relevant and it's significant and it will reach people. There are all these other factors that have now been placed on top of it. I was recently at a convening at the Rockefeller Foundation here in New York during Climate Week. And there was another writer who was speaking to a group of people who said, well, they're never going to buy anything unless you're, part of a very rarefied group of writers. You can't do anything political. It was just so defeatist, that I can't work that way. It's, as I often have said, anything you make is really hard, really, really hard. The movies that I've made with Steven Soderbergh have been very, very difficult, whether they had obvious political connections or not. And so to me, I think if I don't find my passionate connection to the subject matter, I don't think I have the attention span that, is going to get me through it.
Well, it's so interesting, your connection to it with your parents and the psychologist that's opened the film.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I actually got a note from Jim Mitchell, who was one of those psychologists that I still have, and it's really creepy. And it comes close to admitting that they didn't really know if it worked or not. It was bizarre. I mean, the things that I couldn't put in the movie because Daniel insisted that anything that I include be something that was supported by the Senate report, the CIA on the CIA's detention and interrogation program, really was an exercise in restraint.
I miss Laserdisc commentaries. That would have been great to discuss.
Yeah, well, if they still put out DVDs, I could have done that.
Yeah. Thank you. Debora, your series of Diplomat centers on a newly appointed U.S. ambassador to the UK as she diffuses an international crisis and adjusts to the spotlight. It's also about confidence in the workplace. What resonated for you in this idea? And did you were any former or current ambassadors like Madeleine Albright or Nikki Haley influential? Did you interview people for Kate Weiler? You could talk a little bit about that.
So when I was working on Homeland, we would start each season with something that we called Spy Camp, which was we'd all go to Washington for a week and we'd hole up in a townhouse in Georgetown and have a series of people come in and talk to us. And there were CIA people and politicians and journalists and members of the military and people from the State Department. And this woman named Beth Jones came in to talk to us one day. She looked sort of like a kindly grandmother or perhaps your friendly librarian. And she sat down and she started talking. She started talking really, really fast. She had been an ambassador in the Middle East for most of her career. And the amount that went on a regular Tuesday of changing the course of nations while dodging bombs. I mean, it just felt like an action movie. It felt I call her the superhero in a pantsuit. Like the sheer amount of adrenaline sport and actual policy making on the ground day to day, I just found to be breathtaking. And I have all my notes from that, and it just says, this is a series. She is a series. So it was not a lot deeper than that. Although there was also when I was working on Homeland, there was a moment where we were filming a scene. We were shooting in Morocco, and we were shooting in a bombed out building outside Casablanca, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and there was like a mountain of garbage next to us, and Mandy Patinkin and Claire Danes were doing this scene, and it was a great scene. And I just remember sitting and watching it and thinking there's nothing in the scene that couldn't play on the set of The Crown, and I would not be on this roof. And it would get a slightly broader audience. It was an interesting experience. I came into Homeland in the last couple of years of that show. I was such a fan of it. I worshiped that writing so much. I thought that they did incredible work. And I still do think that. But when I said, well, I'm going to go work on Homeland, people would say, oh, I love that show, but I had to take a year off because it was a lot. And I felt that too, like there's only so many torture scenes you can, Scott, write about or watch. At a certain point, it can be punishing. And so I made a really conscious decision to try and take that subject matter and put it in a place that was going to be pretty and location porny, and try to mix it with enough comedy and kind of sense of the absurd to make it a little bit of an easier place to show up.
Thank you. Rick, you wrote for The West Wing and House of Cards. So you have sort of altruistic Jed Bartlett and scoundrel Frank Underwood. So these are like presidential, like polar opposites. Can you talk about sort of writing that dichotomy and like how you maybe approach the humanity in both?
I had a really interesting experience comparing the two when I was done with House of Cards, because I was on the first season of The West Wing and I had seen the pilot and I knew it was something I wanted to work on. And everyone I talked to who hadn't seen the pilot but had heard about it predicted to me that it was going to be a failure, that no one was going to watch this show. And the reason for that was at that moment, Bill Clinton was embroiled in this scandal with a 20-year-old intern named Monica Lewinsky. And people wrongly assumed that the show was going to be about a scandal-ridden White House, that it was going to reflect the reality of what was going on in Washington. And it absolutely wasn't. It was a, Capra-esque idealized look at the hardworking people in the actual West Wing. And so it was a big hit. And then when we started working on House of Cards, it was a year before David Fincher had even started shooting the pilot. We went to Washington for 2 weeks, and it was a different Washington since I had last been there for the West Wing. And a couple of things that I noticed that we were toward the end of Obama's first term, and the shine on his administration was starting to wear a little thin. People were feeling a little bit less like we were in the second coming of Camelot. And in fact, the Republicans shut the government down while we were there. And there was a bomb scare in the Capitol building while we were in the Capitol. And we started going to the, parties and meeting with people, and suddenly it seemed like a whole new crowd of people were in DC. Just 10 or however many years later, there were parties for the top 30 under 30 politicos, and suddenly Washington didn't feel so much like Hollywood for ugly people. It started to feel like Hollywood for beautiful people. And it also seemed like people weren't craving something idealistic in that moment. They were craving something maybe a little more cynical or darker edged, because they were starting to get a little fed up with politics in Washington. And I've thought about that a lot, especially during COVID and since, because I don't know how often, TV writers anyway think about audiences because they're so far removed from them. But I've wondered about that, and I've talked to a couple of producers recently who very much want like a very dark project, about politics in Washington. And I just think, like, I look at the Harris campaign and I think you guys are just completely reading the wrong tarot cards or the wrong, barometer, because I don't think that's what audiences would be interested in right now.
Good point. Thank you. Billy, the Comey Rule is based on James Comey's book. It follows the investigation into Hillary Clinton's private email server and its impact on the election. You were writing it, I think, when Trump, was president and sort of pushing the conspiracy of the deep state. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And what was it like sort of writing in that political minefield, like in real time? And I guess the second part of the question is, the source material is Comey's memoir. So talk about sort of, point of view. You have a choice to have Rod Rosenstein who's Trump's deputy AG, as the narrator. So talk about that in terms of point of view and the choices.
Sure. And I just want to say first, it's really a privilege to be on this panel. I mean, there are some incredible storytellers here, and Professor, thanks for that intro. This is tall cotton, for a kid from the Valley like me.
Me too.
So thank you to all of you. The election of Trump flattened me. I was a check writing Democrat all of my adult life, but that election destroyed me. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I had to be medicated. I cried every day for 6 weeks. It was pretty bad. And I decided that I could never again, as an individual citizen, wake up the morning after an election thinking I could have done more. I just never could put myself in that position again. So as a citizen, I went out and I learned the rules of political messaging. I put myself at the feet of people who understood it. And then every time a Democrat came through town looking for money, which they all do, I said, yeah, I'll be happy to fundraise for you. But first, you and I are going to sit down for 40 minutes. And I'm going to talk to you about how to sound less like a Democrat so that you can make arguments that independent voters can actually hear because they listen in a different frequency. The way that it, and that began the unpaid half of my day, which is helping politicians, helping Democrats, which means speech writing, debate prep, rapid response, whatever they want. But as the Trump election impacted my career, that second, I decided I no longer had any interest in writing anything that didn't in some way reflect America back to itself. I'm old enough that I can now be picky about what I choose to spend my sweat equity on. And I want to write about my country, whether I'm writing a story that's nakedly political, like the Comey Rule, or the equivalent of the Hunger Games, which has loads of politics in it, at least for me. When I sat down to write the Comey Rule, I had read Comey's autobiography, which I thought was extraordinary, but I had to audition for the gig. Comey had to pick me. And so the meeting was going to be over the phone, which was not my preference, but it was Comey in McLean, Virginia, 2 of his book agents in DC, 2 of his book agents in New York, and the producer of the film in LA. And I was telling him basically how I planned to tell the story. And the first 10 minutes, I was crushing it. I mean, everything I was saying, he was loving. And it felt pretty good. And then, and what I was essentially pitching him was, this is a love story between a man and an institution. And everything he does is in defense of that institution, because I wanted to tell a political story in emotional terms. But one of his agents then said to me, how are you going to handle the Hillary stuff? And I said, well, I think we got to take it head on. I don't want to write an unflawed character. And, narratively, this is Frankenstein. You created the monster and the monster destroyed you. And Comey interrupted and said, how did I create the monster? I said, well, sir, you got him elected. And there was this pause. And Comey said, well, I believe there were other factors. I said, yes, I'm sure there were. But the fact is, what you did affected the election by about 6 percentage points. And that was enough. And Comey picked me anyway. That to me is a story about Comey, not a story about me. I would not have picked me under those circumstances. I would have said, fuck off. I don't want that guy telling the story. But Comey decided he wanted someone who would be truthful with him. And in the 18 months that I spent writing and directing and then posting and then fighting for that miniseries, Comey never once said to me, hey, I look like an idiot in this scene, or can you change that line of dialogue? It makes me seem petty. Or it seems like my ego got the better of me. He never did that. He never tried to spin me once. And that told me a lot about who he was and made me feel really good about making, devoting 18 months of my life to telling that story. The other thing I will say about that is when I wrote the first draft, I gave it to him, and every writer on this call, whether you're part of the panel or not, knows that feeling of handing a draft into someone who it's about. And you sweat that read out pretty badly. And I gave it to Comey, and he read it, and thank God he loved it. And the first question I asked him was, did I get Trump right? Did I capture the experience of talking to Trump? And he said, you got it exactly right, because talking to Trump is like being hit by 10 fire hoses at once. And if you can manage to grab one of them and wrestle it to the ground, you are congratulating yourself, but you're still getting hit by 9 other fire hoses. And that is exactly my experience as a citizen when Donald Trump was both a candidate and a president and now an ex-president. It is that feeling of just getting pounded by fire hoses. And I've had about enough, and I'm completely ready to have this man out of my political experience and no longer a threat to my democracy. And I thought in making the Comey Rule in 2019 and literally going to war with Showtime and its parent company, Viacom, to make sure that it would air before the 2020 election. I thought I had put a dagger in this guy and was not going to be hearing from him anymore. And just last sidebar on that, a week before we aired, the president of Showtime called me and said, listen, we're really, really proud of the miniseries, but you should know no one's going to see it. The tracking is in the toilet. The numbers are terrible. No one gives a shit. Thank you for making it, but brace yourself. And then it went out and had the biggest debut of any limited series in Showtime's history by a factor of 4. There is something about that particular man that people find compelling. And that is what we're up against in this political moment.
Absolutely. I love that shot with just like the longest handshake ever from across the room. You kind of that's like a real thing that happened, and it staged very similar, but it's like the longest and the pensive hands. It's so spectacular. I'm just curious, really quickly, did you get any blowback from doing this?
Only from the left. It was actually sort of stunning. The right knew that we had our facts straight. The right knew that they couldn't really attack us. The meanest review I got was actually from the left. It was from a Bernie fan who was so livid that I had made it, and was so hateful of Comey that they went after me. But no, the right left us alone.
Wow, that's interesting. Okay, Lance, this question's for you. So we have a stacked Supreme Court and state-spanning books like It's Russia or North Korea. I read and looked this up that Genderqueer is the #1 banned book in America right now. Are you concerned about stories like Rustin and Milk being in danger? And can you sort of talk about, censorship and, these the dangers of this and the kind of, which is becoming a growing trend?
Yeah, God, not a softball, that one.
No.
Oh, but it's really, I think it cuts to the core of a lot of people here. It should be terrifying what the possibilities are with having Trump in the presidency and really the folks who wrote this Project 2025 who would love to see most of the work we do banned and sidelined. And it's no surprise that queer books, are being banned, but other minority books as well. I mean, this is what happens in such times, in divided times, in difficult times. I just lived the past 10 years in London. And it was really very disheartening to see the relationship between their economy tanking post-Brexit, the tough time the country was having, and the absolute rise in racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia. That country I moved to 10 years ago, which had been rather accepting and in fact topped the list of European countries in terms of acceptance, is no longer even in the top 10 of accepting countries for LGBTQ people. This is what happens when times get tough and when politics get divided. It's not the first time. If you want a really wonderful study of this, I say take a look at Berlin pre-World War II. There's people like Trump who don't have a lot to lose because of who they are. And they will say, you're feeling bad about yourself. You're feeling less powerful because you're no longer the majority, dear white evangelical Christian America. Or you're feeling broke and you're not as wealthy as you used to be, or you've been locked down and you're feeling less than whole. Well, here's a box you can stand on to feel bigger. And it's always a minority. Stand on them. Use their backs to get you higher, so you feel bigger, so you feel taller. And you know, it's a very old play in the political playbook. And right now we're seeing, I think, and it's not, I don't want to just talk about queer books being banned, because there's a lot that's being banned, and or at least the attempt is being made. And that gives comfort to certain kinds of people and certain kinds of voters. And I think that if it succeeds, we're in real trouble as filmmakers and storytellers who tell stories that have a purpose. And really on this call, you know, with this panel, much of that purpose is to create hope in a better world. I mean, come on. I mean, some of these projects, I'm such a huge fan of, because it says, hey, we could do this a little bit better. This is hopeful, or justice matters, or a more equal playing field matters, that we haven't come to the apex of this thing called the human existence. We can do it better, or we can point out what we've done wrong in the past so we don't make those mistakes again. Well, all of that is in jeopardy. And not just because of, you know, the fiscal issues that are going on in Hollywood right now, because I actually think we can get these things made. And I think it was Scott who said, it's always hard. We can still get them made right now. But I am genuinely, I don't want to say afraid, because it feels like it takes our power away. I'm fucking pissed off at the possibility that our unique voices, and the voices from the edges, and the voices of the others, and the voices of the disempowered and the disenfranchised could be silenced for political opportunism, because this orange fucking man wants to stay out of jail so bad he'll throw anybody under the bus. I'm furious. And so if whoever's watching out there, I hope people are watching, I do want to get political for a minute and say, get your ass out there and vote. And once you've done that, make sure that you call 10 people. It's incredibly politically powerful to call 10 people. And in fact, if you're worried, call 10 people who you know they're going to agree with you, and make sure they voted, particularly if they live in Pennsylvania and Michigan, in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Arizona, in Nevada, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and maybe, Texas and Florida. Make sure you call 10 people and you encourage them to vote. And have those tough conversations with those who you think are on the edge here, like my cousin Debbie in Texarkana, Texas, who doesn't know who she's voting for yet. Have those conversations, because for a lot of us, it's existential as creatives, and our voices will be silenced, or we'll have to go to some very extreme measures, which I will, if the attempt is made to silence us. But right now, this is existential. This vote of yours is powerful. And there's only one choice to make if we want to keep our voices alive as minorities in this world, as people who are other than in this world. And let's be frank, every single one of us in this country is a minority in one way or another. It depends on how you slice the pie. They'll come for you next. So vote and get others to vote.
Lance, offline, can you give me Debbie's email? I got to talk to her.
Yeah, get cousin Debbie in Texarkana, Texas.
Get me cousin Debbie on the line. I've got this. Okay, I do this all day long. I'll do messaging on
I
her.
know you
She
do.
won't know, she won't know what hit her, I promise.
No, she'll love you. Just look at that gorgeous face and she'll say, whatever you say, Billy, I'm in.
I'm gonna do a little plug for TV, given that a lot of writers are listening, and given that you guys, you know, you seem to still be interested in writing movies. Here's what TV gives you. What I think, you know, Rick, I learned it on The West Wing. I don't know whether you picked up the same thing, but the thing that The West Wing did was it showed people what life there could be like, and some of the steps towards some things that sometimes work. And it's hard as a citizen, as somebody who reads the news every day and watches it go bad over and over and over. Like, I know all the way that like a million different train wrecks, a million different brick walls, a million different tragedies of how a piece of legislation falls apart or how an institution crumbles, but I don't know enough stories about how it works. And to know that, you know, once upon a time, we worked on a show where after that, a bunch of people went and worked in Washington who had good intentions. Maybe they were corrupt 15 years in. Maybe there wasn't enough antidepressants in the world to get them to stay there, but they went and they did that work for a long time. And the thing that for me has been meaningful with the show that I'm working on now is like, nobody fucking knows what a diplomat does. No, I certainly didn't know. The comment that I get a lot now when I talk to people who have seen the show who are in that field is like, you know, now my parents know what I do. They understand what I do. Just, I think giving people, the thing that's nice about TV is that you can build an environment, you can build a world, and you can just give an audience a time to hang out in it and get to understand it a little bit. And every time I've had a message in mind, and I do all the time, like lists and lists of them, the things that, you know, something that I hear somebody say that like, oh my God, if the world could hear, and I write it down and I build a story around it and I build an episode around it, and the scene where I actually say it gets cut, and it turns out it was too fucking preachy or whatever it was. The messages don't get there, but the world gets there. And to give an audience a way to spend a lot of time with somebody who has basically good values and is basically trying a bunch of different ways to do something. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail, but that the path becomes slightly less mysterious. I think that's powerful. I really do. And Rick, I guess I'm just struggling a lot with getting to know you here in the last 20 minutes and thinking about the different pieces of your career. I struggled with House of Cards. I got really mad at House of Cards because I felt like, yeah, The West Wing was too Pollyanna and it was too simple. It was a lot of things that were sometimes too shiny, sometimes too pat. But it was not, to me, a lesson learned that politicians could be corrupt or that people could be evil. Like, we got it. Like, we got that. We all read that book. We saw that movie. We understand that. And for me, it's much more interesting to think about, like, what if everybody's good? Like, what if what if every Republican, every Democrat, every Iranian, like, what if everybody has good values, loves their children, and actually loves the idea of children in other parts of the world? Like, what if everybody's actually trying and it still looks like this? Like, that to me is a fascinating question. Like, that to me is really dramatically interesting. Like, if there aren't villains and we're still massacring the shit out of each other, like, what is that about? And to like, guys, go take these things that you're interested in and turn them into something that you can talk about for 50 hours. Like, 50 hours is a long time. You know, people go in there and they stay in and they kind of learn the ropes.
Deborah,
Hey, can I?
Damn it.
Yeah.
can I jump in there for a sec? I just want to, I'm 100% with you on House of Cards. When we were in DC, we went to sit down with Dee Dee Myers, who was our consultant on the West Wing. She was the first woman press secretary under Bill Clinton, and she was running a think tank. And we sat down with her, and she wanted Bo to explain to her what Francis Underwood wanted. And Bo insisted that it was just power. Okay, we didn't see Trump coming at that point, but I had the same, I was on Dee Dee's side. I did enough work into Dick Cheney to know that he started out as a human being in Wyoming. He was a complicated person, but I understood why he wanted to make, once he was the youngest chief of staff, co-chief of staff under Gerald Ford, and he had to watch Ford explain himself, new to office, for why he pardoned Nixon. And he felt that that was the weakest the presidency had ever been. He'd never seen a sitting president forced to his knees in that way. And I really felt sympathy for Cheney in that moment when I found that out about him. And I wish House of Cards had been 10 times smarter than I think it turned out to be. So I'm with you 100% on that kind of messaging. And just to put a pin on this, the cast of The West Wing and Aaron were just at the White House like a week ago. And Biden thanked them for inspiring a generation of young people to go into politics. And I thought, how many television series in the history of television get those kinds of thanks or kudos?
Lori, can I throw one other idea in here?
Absolutely.
I want writers to think about the possibility of politics in an unpolitical or apolitical movie. And by that, I mean, Black Panther did as much for African Americans as any political movie could have possibly done. Like the idea, oh, wow, there's a Black superhero. Think about what that did to a generation of African American kids who have that as a hero to look up to. Think about, I know this is going to sound like a ridiculous example, but think about Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2 and the physicality of that, making an entire generation completely redefine what a woman was capable of. There are political movies that are dressed up as something else. As I said, Hunger Games has a lot to say about fascism and authoritarianism. And there are movies that have done for gay people or for disabled people or for Latino people. They have redefined them for generations without going anywhere near the political sphere. And the power of writing is that you can literally redefine what a group of people are capable of just by giving life to a character and ennobling them and humanizing them and dimensionalizing them and putting them through struggles and having them triumph. That can change the world. And they don't have to be running for anything. And I would encourage all writers to think of everything they write in political terms.
Excellent point. I have a few more questions about just about the work, but please, I'm really enjoying this kind of full-throated conversation. So everyone, please feel free to jump in and continue the discussion. And by the way, Lance, I read today, that the biggest sort of new voter registrations are all Republicans in California. That stunned me. So I agree with you. We need to take 10 people and go out and vote. So I just want to lock that in there. Okay, Scott, so let's talk about The Loudest Voice, which is about Roger Ailes and the rise of Fox News. Just sort of tell us your approach to him as this controversial character. And this can kind of go into, the challenge that we as artists face, when media empires are sowing disinformation.
Wow, I didn't see that one coming. Look, I was very, very grateful to Liza Chazen for asking me to come and do the finale of that, because I felt that was a very, very important story to tell. Because it is a massive problem. I think one of the things right now that we're dealing with, in addition to, the algorithms that are sending us really, really devastating messages, and that determine our feeds and that are kind of running our world, is the fact that there are people like Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes who want it that way. And it's really hard to think about how you overcome that. I mean, before I was a screenwriter, I worked in advertising for a very long time, and I worked on Bill Clinton's campaign. And I remember sitting there with great disappointment hearing Mandy Grunwald in the 90s say, well, we need money. We need to figure out a way to get Wall Street to give us their money. So let's just take all of the more centrist ideas, but stay where we are on abortion. And I was sort of flabbergasted that that was how cynical it was going to be all the way around. And I think one of the most corrosive parts of that, and again, you know, I just, last year I did a show at Apple called Extrapolations. Don't feel bad if you haven't seen it or heard of it, because nobody did. And yet it had, you know, Meryl Streep and pretty much every other movie star you can name in it. And it was about climate. And one of the things that I was told about over and over again is, you know, don't take away people's hope. You know, Michael Moore interviewed me at one point and he said, we've really got to get over our addiction to hopium. And I think it's a huge mistake. We've created, or we've been fed an infantile continuum that puts hope at one end, okay, and like despair at the other. That's the wrong continuum. That is not a continuum that applies to art. Really, the issues are there is action and activity and engagement or disengagement. That's the continuum that I find and I try and react to. You know, it's why I loved, you know, the first year, you know, that I wrote The Informant, which again, I wanted to have it be a comedy and it was very political, was the year that Lance won for Milk. And I loved seeing that movie so much. And I loved it, seeing it win. And again, like, I think we have to be more imaginative about how we generate action. And don't, if you're a writer out there, don't get sucked into this view of you've got to be hopeful. You know, I think right now, and I think this is what Rick was saying earlier, you know, it's one thing to talk about a campaign sparking joy as opposed to another one, you know, pushing people into despair. But I think we have to be very careful with the messages we're putting out to make sure that we're dealing with the reality that people are finding in their lives. And that's sort of my biggest concern right now. I mean, I had this fascinating experience. I work with a group called Good Energy that tries to go into writers' rooms and teach people how to talk about the environment. And there's a woman there named Anna Jane Joyner, and she does really great work. And Anna's father is a televangelist on the Gulf Coast and is really the most diametrically opposed person, daughter, father that you could possibly imagine. And she was with me during Climate Week, and she said, you know, my whole town just got wiped off the face of the earth. And like, I can't sit here and continue to tell people to be hopeful. You know, we need to actually be active, you know, and this message of hope, I think, is encouraging a level of passivity that is the same kind of passivity that allows someone to buy a Tesla and not be outraged or drive it off a fucking cliff when you see what Elon Musk is doing. Like, you can't, you know, go ahead, Lance.
No, I think it's a really interesting conversation about hope. I find it necessary, deeply necessary, particularly, you know, where I come from, the circumstances I come from, the people I know. And it's not hope or despair for them, it's hope or check out. It's hope or I'm done. You know, and part of my realization, not just listening to the Bayard Rustins or to the Barack Obamas or Harvey Milk about hope, and Harvey said it, I think, very well, and to paraphrase it, hope is necessary, but it's absolutely insufficient. And that's what you have to get across. But if you're not delivering some sort of hope in the message, a lot of people, not us, but a lot of people will check out. And so you know, I think what's important is to figure out how we can deliver hope as a call to action, deliver hope in a way that we say, that's not sufficient. That's not enough for you to simply be hopeful. But I'll use as an example that taught me sort of, and it's, you know, I know some of my stuff can be very touchy-feely, you know, overly emotional at times. But that comes from having grown up in HIV/AIDS and watching, you know, because I was in the 80s in San Francisco as a teenage kid in through the 90s, just watching everybody die. And the message in the commercials to me as a teenager and adolescents were literally at one point 2 skeletons fucking each other. There was no hope in it. So you know what my generation started to do? They became bug chasers, as they called them. They started purposely getting it because it was inevitable. There was no hope. And, you know, once the campaigns changed around HIV/AIDS to one that had a little bit of hope that you could live a decent life and have, you know, a partner you could actually have sex and love with, just a little bit of hope, but you had to have action. You better put on that fucking condom. But there was hope as a part of it. It is necessary for progress, but you're right, it is absolutely insufficient. So making
I want to amplify that. I think it's so important. Both points are so important, but I'm actually at a political event right now and I have to go deliver a speech at 8:20. So I'm gonna bail, but I just want to amplify that. Right now, in the country that we all love, 62% of Americans believe that if they make enough noise, they can make a corporation pay attention to them as a consumer. 62%. 4% of Americans believe that if they make enough noise, they can make their government pay attention to them as a citizen. 4%, which means 96% of Americans do not believe that, which is the problem for the Democratic Party because we're identified as the party of government. People need to believe that they matter. And this to me is the link between what Scott is saying and what Lance is saying. It's not just a question of hope. It's that it's an empowerment. It's convincing people that they matter to themselves, to their family, to their community, to our country, to our collective future. When people don't feel that they matter, society crumbles. That's when someone walks into Sandy Hook and says, oh, I don't fucking matter. Watch this. Boom, 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 boom. We come out of the womb needing to know that we matter. 65% of Americans, when polled recently, said they don't believe they matter. When a study was done on Trump's campaign lines in 2016, the most effective by far was I will be your voice. That was the one that spiked. It was spectacularly untrue, but it essentially said, you matter. You're not just a vote to me. I care about you. Again, giant lie, but an audience that wanted to believe it. I think that our work needs to communicate hope, needs to communicate outrage, needs to communicate understanding of complex problems, for sure. But mostly it needs to say to people, you can do something about this. You matter. In some way, if you lead your life slightly more decently, if you are slightly more activist in pushing for the things that are important to you, if you fight a little bit harder to make your neighborhood or your community or your city or your state or your country a better place for your kids to grow up in, that will matter. If you can communicate that in your work, then you have essentially created 330 million activists. And you have sneaked them into a political mindset without their even knowing that they're there, and told them that they have power, they have some agency. And the fact is, we're going to need all of them. I think about, you know, what Scott was saying about his friend whose town was wiped out. We're all in this climate battle together. We're all in the democracy battle together. What the last 9 years have taught us is that democracy is a decision. It is not automatic, like gravity or the sun rising in the east. Democracy only happens because Americans decide that it must happen. You know, in watching a Zoom talk like you're watching right now, you are making that decision. In voting, you are making that decision. If you are postcarding or phone banking or knocking doors or flying to Arizona or flying to Nevada or flying to Philly to make sure the turnout happens, you are making that decision and you are making a difference. I think our work needs to convince people that that's their role, that we are all citizen patriots together.
Thank you, Billy. Yeah, I appreciate this conversation.
I got to run. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask him about sort of his messaging guidance that he's doing with the House and Senate, but I feel like he can do a whole sort of show on that. So, but I do appreciate the conversation between the balance of hope and despair. I have a caustic tale coming out next year. We're having a lot of those conversations right now. I think it's a really, important film, but it's a challenge right now to talk about what we're going to do with it and when it's coming out after the election and all that stuff. So I really appreciate the conversation. I have so many more questions. We're running out of time, but I have so many more questions about, all of your projects, but I'm going to move down just to open it up a little bit because we only have, 10 minutes remaining. So, and by the way, Josh, if you want to jump in, if you have a really good question from the audience, please feel free to do it now. But let's talk really quickly about The Apprentice, which just had a tricky path, last weekend to release. It was initially passed on by distributors in a libel suit, the whole bit. It's like, what would you say about writers sort of moving the needle and reaching audiences, sort of when shareholders tell us like politics don't sell? And I think, Rick, you mentioned, or maybe it was Scott, I'm sorry, but someone mentioned that they're not finding that, but I'm curious about that.
I am finding that for sure. I mean, I had a play it was called Five Presidents, about all the presidents at Nixon's funeral, that was about to go on a national tour and then end up off Broadway in 2016. And when Trump became the nominee, one by one, every theater on that tour dropped out and the whole thing fizzled. And it was like, in my mind, I demonized everyone equally in that play. All five of those presidents, Ford, Clinton, Bush Sr., Reagan, and Carter, if I'm not missing anybody. But I definitely do find that's, I have a project now that's based on a real story involving a soldier who had a relationship with John McCain. And we're being told by our producers went out and sort of pre-pitched it to everybody. And the feedback we're getting is, we like the soldier story, but we don't like the political relationship with John McCain. We don't like the real life politics as being part of the fabric of the story because it won't sell right now. And I just want to say something about, we're all storytellers, and now more than ever, when I engage with a film or a series, I desperately need it to teach me something about how to keep myself moving forward in this world, whether that's with hope. It can't be with despair, but I need to know how to not be eaten by the lion, I need that from a story. And I feel like that's my obligation as a storyteller as well. And so it's odd to me because I think right now we have two candidates. One of them is telling us constantly that we're all going to be eaten by the lion, and the other candidate is telling us that maybe there's a way to not be eaten by the lion. And maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, can I just clarify for one quick second? That was not me attacking hope. I just want to review what I said, which is the continuum is not hope and despair. The continuum for art, I believe, is taking action or not, or passivity. And that I think is really how human beings frequently respond to artistic messages. And so, yeah, I agree with Rick. Like, you got to give people a place to take the emotion of it. And, what Lance said is exactly right. The response to, two skeletons having sex is the action of putting on a condom and keeping the person you love alive and yourself alive. So yes, I recognize that hope is an incredibly important part. But, you know, like the issue that I'm trying to zero in on is I think we sometimes, in regards to the streamers who pay us and the studios who pay us, they just want a message of hope. They don't really want to understand or have us talk about what the issue is that's preventing, you know, change. Because that's really what we're talking about, is how can something change? You can't necessarily just hope it into changing. We need to give people reasons and the truth about why things are the way they are.
Right. I think a film like maybe Parasite is a really good example of how they balanced both those things, sort of despair and hope. And it's kind of, in the end, a despair story. But the way that was, the artistry involved in the end of that film is just a really terrific way, for lack of a better word, of doing it. So I think, you know, it comes down to also our writing and you know, how we wrap our stories and what they're ultimately saying in the end. So and I that's a good place to sort of dovetail into on a lighter note. If, you know, anyone wants to share a political film or series that's influenced them, that's important, they'd want to share with our viewers, please jump in.
I just want to put a plug in for my dear late friend Norman Lear, who I had the great fortune of spending a fair amount of time with during his life. And man, like, yeah. I will tell you that that guy said to me a year and a half ago that this was the scariest time he's ever seen in his life in America. And I really think we would do well to look at someone who lived through 100 years and a war and a lot of really horrible shit and go, wow, if this is the worst, we really need to wake up.
What a pioneer. Anyone else want to jump in with maybe something that's been really influential? Or
Larry Gelbart, for me, for the same reasons as Norman Lear with MASH, you know. My dad was a Korean War vet, and somehow that Larry's work made me want to be a writer, and it helped me understand my dad a little better in a weird way.
Josh, do you have anything that you want to jump in and bring?
Yeah, we have a couple questions here. I mean, first of all, I just want to thank you all. This has been just such a phenomenal panel, and thanks to Billy and to Annette. You've all just brought such wisdom and perspective, and you know, I have been fired up and tearing up off camera. So thank you all, really. There are a couple questions that came in the panel that were a bit more craft related, and I don't know if we've covered things that are as crafty, and we may not have a lot of time, so I might combine these two into one. But this first one says, in politically charged stories, how do you approach the challenge of dimensionalizing characters who are part of, quote, the system, whether it's politicians, lobbyists, military leaders, people who are famously dislikable? Are there particular techniques or character beats, ways you rely on to maintain that complexity for people you personally hate? You know, would have been an interesting one for Billy in regards to Comey Rule. But for all of you, you know, I'm curious about that. And the other question, very similar, talks about, you know, what are techniques you use to really bring emotion to, you know, subjects that can feel maybe more educational or pedantic, and, you know, you really humanize them. All of you do that so well.
Well, I'm going to start with unlikable characters, which is, if you don't like a character, don't write it. Like, you got to find a way to like them. You've got to find a way to understand them, and you've got to find a way to believe that their argument has some merit. And even if you're just lying to yourself, you got to write them as somebody who has integrity and intelligence and dimensionality. You got to find the thing about them that you can believe. Otherwise, they're just boring. Otherwise, you just end up with a boring scene. Like, it, you know, nobody, it takes very, very little time to convince an audience that somebody's a bad guy, and then you're kind of done. So if you can convince them that they are looking at somebody who they may not agree with, but has a really good argument, you're much more likely to have them with you for a longer time.
I want to second that. You know, I think for all of us who do political stuff, obviously there's people who we would not agree with, who we have to write. One of my favorite tricks is to figure out what their reward system is and why. Like, what is it that's giving them that dopamine hit, that serotonin hit? Where is it coming from for them and why? Like when we were talking about, you know, Dick Cheney just a little bit ago. You can find that in his history and start to understand the reward system for them. And in doing that, and as you start to list it out and dig into their history, you start to find empathy, or at least not always. Some are sociopaths that I've also had to write. But you start to understand where they're getting their hits. They're getting their hits from these things, that this is in some way positive for them. And if you start to write from that, they become a little more human, even when they are, you know, sociopath murderers, which I've had to tackle.
I agree with exactly what was said, but I also think if it's possible, go and sit with them and meet them and talk to them and keep talking to them until you find exactly what Lance just said. Find, you know, some common ground and work out from there.
It's really alarming though, isn't it, Scott? I mean, I remember sitting in maximum security prison in Draper, Utah, across from a mass murderer. Probably one of the most charming, electric people I've ever sat with. It actually was frighteningly easy to like it. And you start to understand it from that perspective. They aren't the sort of, you know, scary guy in the horror film that they might be depicted as in the news. It's very true and chilling.
I think my version of what is their dopamine hit is, what do they believe they're protecting? And the sociopath is often aggressively and painfully protecting themselves, and you may not agree with what their goals are, but you, I think, find a way to believe in their fight.
Yeah, there was an interesting bit in the Dick Cheney research I did for an HBO project that didn't get made. And we had the Spartan Gelman book called Angler, which was the biography of a biography about Dick Cheney. And the thing that I found was there was a letter that I got to read a copy of that Bush W got a colonoscopy, and during the moments, the hour or two that he had that colonoscopy, Cheney was actually the president for like 2 hours. And so he wrote a letter to his then grandchildren while he was the president, a letter meant to be read after his death. And for me, that opened up like just a whole new way of looking at him.
We're going to have to get a drink at some point and talk about this, Rick, because we both wrote that movie.
Okay, great. Yes, Robbie Bates. I think we're in good company. I'm in bed.
This was a very impressive list of us.
I think we can talk for hours, and I wish we had more time. I so appreciate everyone for being so candid and open and talking about this time and how we see ourselves through your work. So thank you. It's deeply felt, and I really appreciate all of you. So thank you so much. And I also want to just have a big thank you to Greg Mitchell, who's our sort of man behind the curtain, and he does all this stuff, right? And also my subcommittee chair, Josh Chesler, thank you so much. Also want to thank Christina Callis and David Gambino, as well as the WGA Genre Committee for supporting this that I brought up to them not that long ago. And I'm just so glad we can have this talk before the election. So I appreciate it. And I'm just going to leave with the immortal words of Margaret Mead, as quoted by television's fake president, Jed Bartlett. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world. So let's get out there and vote. Great. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.